Hello, this is Dick Mitchell from St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Highland, Maryland, and I am recording the first of a four-part series on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. First, let me get my screens in order. There we go. This is a pilgrimage to the Holy Land first session. My wife, Beth, and I have been fortunate to visit the Holy Land in two separate pilgrimages. In 2012, we did a 10-day tour with the Diocese of Maryland, and in 2022, last fall, we did a similar trip with Virginia Theological Seminary. Each tour was Episcopal-oriented, led by a senior churchman and an excellent local guide, but each tour had its own itinerary and its own perspective. So from these tours, I want to share some insights about the Holy Land and touring those lands, perhaps to give some of you the idea for making your own pilgrimage to the Holy Land. First, the name. It is truly the land of Israel, the ancient biblical name for the land that was the home of the 12 Hebrew tribes. In the Middle Ages, Western Christians called it Terra Sancta, which translates to the Holy Land. Many of us still use that name. Also, it is sometimes called Palestine. Now, Palestine is the Latin version of Philistia, the land of the Philistines, the traditional enemy of the ancient Israelites. After the Jews had revolted twice against the Romans, an angry Roman emperor in the 2nd century AD sought to obliterate the Jewish names of the land. He renamed Jerusalem, and he renamed the countryside the province of Palestine. Needless to say, Jewish people did not refer to their traditional homeland as Palestine. Now, the heart of the Holy Land is the land around Jerusalem, called Judea. Judea is the Greek version of Judah. Judah was the name of the large Israelite tribe in the South Country. Judea is hill country, away from the coast. Remember that the ancient Israelites were not seagoing people. They were shepherds and farmers and townspeople living in hill country. Ancient Jerusalem was a hill town and was surrounded by other hills, such as the Mount of Olives. In the Bible, Jerusalem is also called Zion, particularly in reference to Mount Zion, the traditional name of the hill on which the oldest part of the city stood. Now, about 12 miles outside Jerusalem lies Bethlehem, the home of King David and the birthplace of our Lord. Bethlehem, likewise, is a hill town, and the Church of the Nativity sits atop that hill. Now, today, of course, Jerusalem and Bethlehem both are substantial cities spread over many hills and valleys. Now, when our own country was settled, major cities were built along major bodies of water, such as DC or Baltimore, New York, and so forth, for communication and for transportation. In the Holy Land, ancient towns were located on hilltops for protection. Water sources were springs and cisterns. And then other towns like Jericho lie in the desert, and their sources of water are wells and oases. Hebrew scripture itself often makes reference to the hill country. Psalm 23, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, Or Psalm 121, I lift up my eyes to the hills. From whence does my help come? Or the second chapter of Isaiah, it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains. Now, in Jesus' time, the other significant local homeland for Jews, besides Judea, was the Galilee, the traditional fertile land stretching roughly from the Mediterranean seacoast eastward to the Sea of Galilee. The Galilee is in the north, part of the northern kingdom, whose people were exiled by the Assyrians. Jewish folk repopulated the countryside probably in the 1st or 2nd centuries before Christ. There is an immense verticality to the Holy Land. For instance, Jerusalem is at an elevation of 2,600 feet, whereas Jericho, 20 miles east of Jerusalem, is 850 feet below sea level. So that if you leave Jericho and drive up to Jerusalem, you ascend some 3,400 feet, passing sea level in the middle of the desert. Similarly, Nazareth in Galilee is at an elevation of about 1,000 feet, but the Sea of Galilee, just 20 miles east of Nazareth, is 700 feet below sea level. Now, the source of these differences is a major cleft running north-south through the Asian-African landmass, beginning above the Sea of Galilee, coming down the Jordan River Valley, through the Dead Sea, and then down the Red Sea and into Eastern Africa, so that the Jordan River Valley is among the lowest spots on the surface of the earth. That valley can be hot and humid, and with irrigation can be fruitful and productive. But Jerusalem can be dry and cold and windswept. Jews in their time spoke of going up to Jerusalem, and that has some basis also in topography. So what can we say about the convoluted history of the Holy Land? The history has certainly laid over the land and really affects our visit and pilgrimage to the land. How is the capital of the ancient kingdom of Israel and the place of Jesus' resurrection become the Jerusalem of today? So I'll start with King David, who captured Jerusalem for the Israelite people and made it his capital. Then his son Solomon built the first temple in Jerusalem, but Solomon alienated the northern Israelite tribes, so that after his death, probably about the year 930, the kingdom broke into two: the northern kingdom, called Israel, and the southern kingdom, called Judah. Jerusalem served as the capital of Judah, the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom survived for almost 200 years, but then was broken up by the Assyrian Empire. And here's an image of the Temple of Solomon and a map of the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. Then, in 587 years before the birth of Christ, Jerusalem was conquered by the Babylonians. Solomon's temple was destroyed, and many of the people were carried off into exile in Babylon. This really began the great Jewish diaspora, so that the Jews were in time spread all over the Middle East. And it is from this time, really, that we begin to call them Jews more appropriately than Israelites. Then, subsequently, Cyrus the Great defeated Babylon and established the Persian Empire. Cyrus permitted many of the Jewish exiles to return home, and those returning Jews built a second temple in Jerusalem. Many other Jews remained in Babylon, and the city of Babylon long remained a center of Jewish life and culture. Then, in the 300s BC, Alexander the Great destroyed the Persian Empire, and after his premature death, his generals divided up his conquests among themselves. For more than a century, Judea lived under the rule of Egypt with few problems. But about 200 BC, Judea fell under the Seleucid rulers up in Syria, and they tried to Hellenize the Jewish people, suppress Jewish worship and traditions, in effect, to make them Greeks. This led to the Maccabean uprising and a series of bloody wars, and the Maccabean or Hasmonean dynasty of the 2nd century BC. But then in the 1st century before Christ, the Hasmoneans themselves fell into a civil war. And who should intervene? Of course, the Romans. After decades of political back and forth, including interventions by Pompey the Great and by Julius Caesar, the Romans installed one of our favorites, Herod the Great, as their local king, the wicked King Herod of the nativity stories. Herod was a significant ruler. He rebuilt and enlarged the Second Temple. Here's an image of a depiction of Herod's temple. Herod built many other substantial structures that survive today, and I'll talk about some of them in a later talk. Herod ruled for about 35 years. He pretty much kept the peace, and when he died, his client kingdom was divided up among his sons. This brings us down to the time of Jesus and Jesus' life and ministry. But we're telling the Jewish story, and the Jewish people despised the Romans and their client kings, and they rose in revolt against their Roman overlords in the year AD 66. They fought fiercely for years before submission. Now, this was a major war for the Romans, not some local insurrection. The winning Roman general, Vespasian, became emperor, and he established an imperial dynasty that lasted into the following century. However, the suppression of the Jewish revolt led to the destruction of the Second Temple and the permanent end of temple worship in Jerusalem. Although the temple was destroyed, the Temple Mount, the large 37-acre plaza that surrounded the temple, survived. The Roman troops simply threw the stones of the temple over the side of the Temple Mount, where they rest today, and you can see them. Now, after that first loss, the Jews again rose in revolt about the year 135 AD, and once again, the revolt was suppressed. Now, the Romans completely destroyed Jerusalem and rebuilt a Roman city in its place, even gave it a new Latin name, Aelia Capitolina, and they barred Jews from the city. Roman armies destroyed Jewish villages throughout Judea so that the Jewish religious life became centered on the area of Galilee in the north, but also in Babylon in the east, which survived as a major center of culture until the Muslim era. Then, in the 4th century AD, during the reign of the Emperor Constantine, the Roman Empire became Christian, and Christian churches were built. Constantine's mother, St. Helena, herself a devout Christian, came to the Holy Land and attempted to identify places associated with the life of Christ, based upon the memories and traditions of local Christian communities. Her inquiries led to the construction of churches, and the locations of those churches today identify sites that were considered authentic as early as the 4th century AD. Significant among those sites are the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, the Annunciation site in Nazareth, and the baptismal site along the Jordan River. The oldest surviving Christian church in the Holy Land is the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, built about 300 AD and then rebuilt about 575 AD after an earthquake. Today's church is basically this 6th century church. Also, beginning in the 4th century, if not earlier, thousands of Christian pilgrims streamed to the Holy Land to visit the places associated with the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. The Eastern Romans, or Byzantines, renamed the city of Jerusalem, and they built the first church of the Holy Sepulchre. And here is a depiction, a model of what that first church may have looked like. But the Byzantines left the great Temple Mount untouched, and it became largely a dump or a trash heap, and Jews were still excluded from the city. The Holy Land remained Christian for some 300 years, but in the 7th century, shortly after Muhammad's death, Arab armies swept out of the desert and overran Egypt, North Africa, Syria, and the Holy Land. The Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire did defend the Holy Land, and in the year 636, the Byzantines fought a fierce 6-day battle with the Arabs at a place known as Yarmouk. Yarmouk is just southeast of the Sea of Galilee. It really was one of the great battles of our civilization. The Byzantine army was destroyed, and the Eastern Roman Empire was pushed back into the heartland of today's Turkey, and the Arabs conquered the Holy Land. The emperor in Constantinople never again ruled in the Holy Land. The Muslims cleared the Temple Mount, and they built there 2 great structures. First, a massive mosque called the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and then also an 8-sided shrine over a great rock called the Dome of the Rock, approximately at the spot where Herod's temple had stood. These 2 structures survive today, and they dominate the Temple Mount. And I'll talk more about the Temple Mount later. Christians continued to make pilgrimages to the Holy Land, now traveling through dangerous frontier territories and preferably making most of the trip by sea. The Muslims largely tolerated these pilgrimages, but difficulties arose in the 11th century. The Holy Land was then ruled by caliphs from their new capital in Egypt called Cairo. About 1009, the Caliph al-Hakim, known to history as the Mad Caliph, ordered the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and so it was flattened to its foundations. Both Christians and Jews were persecuted, and this gave rise to much concern in Christian Europe. Later, the arrival of fierce nomadic Turkish warriors who wrestled the Holy Land from its more sedentary Arab rulers threatened both Christian pilgrims and the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople, who appealed to Western Europe for assistance. The Europeans then responded with the military expeditions that we call the Crusades. The First Crusade took Jerusalem and held it for most of the 12th century, and Christian-held states survived up and down. The Christian-held states on the coast survived up and down the Mediterranean until almost 1300. Those Western Crusaders had a serious impact on the landscape. They built fortresses and churches, and many remain, or their ruins. Here's a Crusader church and the ruins of a Crusader castle. In Jerusalem, they set up shop on the Temple Mount, and they used both the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock for administrative purposes. They did not destroy them. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre itself was rebuilt, though smaller than the church from Constantine's time. That church survives today with many, many modifications. And it's basically the Crusader church. The great Muslim warrior Saladin pushed the Crusaders out of Jerusalem, and his successors, ruling from Egypt, held the Holy Land for another 300 years. During this time, the percentage of Christians in the land diminished. The Holy Land probably for the first time acquired a Muslim majority, though many Christian communities survived and even thrived. The Holy Land changed hands again in 1517, when the Ottoman Turks, who had earlier taken Constantinople and brought an end to the Eastern Roman Empire, seized control of the Holy Land. They would rule the Holy Land for 400 years. Suleiman the Magnificent was the Sultan. Suleiman was a contemporary of Henry VIII and Martin Luther. The Ottoman Turks themselves became a serious menace to Christian Europe. They conquered Hungary and in 1529 unsuccessfully besieged Vienna. The old city of Jerusalem that we see today, the walled city, is very much a product of the Turks and Suleiman the Magnificent. Suleiman rebuilt the walls so that the walls we see today are really the 16th century Turkish walls. The Temple Mount is Turkish in atmosphere and decoration, in my view. It was the Ottomans who set up many of the old city traditions, such as the designations of the Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and Armenian quarters. It was the Ottomans who sorted out the ownership of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre after a series of disputes, chiefly between the Orthodox and the Catholics. Then, by the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was in decline and under threat from an expansive Tsarist Russia. The Ottomans sought friends in Europe. They often did this by way of concessions in the Holy Land to the Christian West. More sites were freed up as Christian pilgrimage sites. A Crusader church near the Temple Mount was returned to the Catholic Church, and traditional churches were built in the Holy Land. The Holy Land was rediscovered by Westerners in the second half of the 19th century, likely in connection with the construction and opening of the Suez Canal. The Prince of Wales, the Austrian Emperor, former President Ulysses Grant, Mark Twain, and the German Emperor all visited Jerusalem, and modern archaeology really got a head start as American and British amateurs started digging all over Jerusalem. Also, the late 19th century saw the first waves of Jewish settlers moving into the Holy Land, chiefly from Europe, but also from Russia. Tel Aviv itself was founded on the coast in 1909. This was in connection with the 19th century rise of Zionism, the movement to create a Jewish homeland in the traditional lands of ancient Egypt. During World War I, as a political consideration based really just on its own war aims, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, which proposed that the Palestinian territories should include a Jewish homeland. Now, the Ottoman Empire chose to throw its lot in with the Central Powers in World War I, and therefore they found themselves at war with Britain. The fighting in the Middle East was brutal. A British army pushed up out of Egypt into the Holy Land in 1917 and conquered it from the Ottomans. At the end of the war, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and the Republic of Turkey rose in its remnants. And Allied powers created the modern states of Syria, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq out of former Ottoman territories. The lands that today we know as Israel, the Palestinian territories, and the Kingdom of Jordan were given to Britain to administer as mandates of the League of Nations. Then came World War II. World War II was a disaster for the Jewish diaspora, with 6 million Jews dying in the Holocaust, and perhaps another 1 million surviving the war in continental Europe. Many of those survivors felt that they had to leave Europe, and they sought to immigrate to Palestine. There had regularly been civil unrest in the 1930s between Jews and Arabs in Palestine, and by way of compromise, Britain had sought to restrict Jewish immigration. But that raised more issues, so that after World War II, there was a Jewish terror campaign against the Brits over this immigration issue. In the end, the British simply turned the issue over to the brand new United Nations, and the UN proposed a division of the Palestinian mandate between the Arabs and the Jews. So that when that mandate ended in 1948, the Jews proclaimed the independent state of Israel. And Israel was then immediately attacked by several Arab neighbor states that objected to the concept of any Jewish state. The Israelis fought back, whipped the Arabs badly, and the fighting ended pursuant to a 1949 ceasefire line that bore little, if any, resemblance to the proposed UN division of the former mandate. The Israelis held the coast and Galilee and the Negev desert, and the Arabs held the old city of Jerusalem and most of the Judean hill country, including Bethlehem and Hebron. The ceasefire line was called the Green Line, and it today largely defined the so-called Palestinian territories. The Arab-controlled lands were then administered by Jordan and Egypt and what we would today call, respectively, the West Bank and Gaza. Then in 1967 came the Six-Day War, when in 6 days, the Israelis defeated the Syrians, the Egyptians, and the Jordanians, and occupied the entire West Bank all the way to the Jordan River, leading in time to their annexation of the entire city of Jerusalem. Later, in 1994, Israel and Jordan signed a peace treaty, which demilitarized their border and permitted regular transits across the border at the Jordan River. The Palestinian lands are now governed by the Oslo Accords of 1993. Then, After a series of terrorist bombings in the early 2000s, the Israeli government built a security barrier between Israel and the Palestinian territories. In much of the nation, it is simply a barbed wire fence, but in and around Jerusalem and Bethlehem, it is a high, unattractive concrete wall. Today, as Western and largely Christian tourists or pilgrims travel around and about the Holy Land, they will cross the security barrier several times and usually be aware of security concerns and police forces. Moreover, so-called Jewish settlers have built a string of outpost communities throughout the West Bank, so that the Arab territories now look more like Swiss cheese, given the presence of these Jewish settlements. So, history, politics, and geography have shaped the territories that we call the Holy Land, from the Babylonians to the Greeks, the Romans through Crusaders and the Turks, down to World Wars I and II. We cannot escape history. It flavors any Holy Land pilgrimage. So in my next talk, I want to talk about specific sites and locations, and I will start with the Galilee. Thank you for sharing this time with me.